In today's video, I have some NHL trade rumors I'd like to discuss, mainly focusing on four teams, being the Minnesota Wild, the Philadelphia Flyers, the Boston Bruins, and the Toronto Maple Leafs. I also want to give my thoughts and comments here on the possibility of the Toronto Maple Leafs forwards like Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner potentially being targeted for an offer sheet this coming offseason. We'll discuss all that coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned off the top, we have some updated NHL trade rumors. Most of today's information came from insider trading last night on TSN from insiders Darren Dreger and Pierre LeBrun. Now some of the stuff we kind of touched on a little bit before, so some of this is kind of updated info where some of it is also kind of new. So first of all, let's get started with the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, as we've discussed before, and as you're well aware, they have a new general manager in town named Chuck Fletcher. Now, Fletcher's only been on the job a short time. I think he's got about a week and a half, going on 2 weeks in now. So he's had enough time to analyze his team and really has a good grasp on what he'd like to do moving forward to try to make some improvements. Now, it was mentioned on Insider Trading that he's basically touched base with at least half of the NHL right now. So half the league he's had conversations with. Doesn't mean they get into deep trade talks or anything too serious, but he's certainly putting feelers out there, letting teams know kind of what he's looking for and what he might be prepared to give up just to kind of get the ball rolling a little bit. But basically, it's believed that he's looking for a goaltender, which would come as no surprise. Also looking for an experienced veteran defenseman, as a lot of their decor is pretty young, so he'd like to get some more experience back there. And he'd also like to have an additional top 9 forward. Now, they didn't get into discussing a whole lot about what they'd be prepared to trade out, but obviously, if they're bringing a goaltender in with all the goalies they have around, would not be surprising to see at least one goalie move out. And there's certainly lots of question marks around Flyers forward Wayne Simmonds as well. Of course, Ron Hextall seemed to be quite reluctant to give him a longer-term deal that he was believed to be looking for, but we're not quite sure exactly how Chuck Fletcher feels about that as of yet. He certainly values the leadership qualities that Simmonds can bring and the value, off the ice in the room and all that type of thing that he can bring to the team. But at the same time, they have to be comfortable here with what they're paying him based on what he's now, bringing on the ice as well with his age and injuries he suffered, etc. So time will tell how the Flyers proceed, but that is what they're out there looking for. It's hard to say exactly who they go after. Now, as far as a veteran defenseman, there's certainly a number of them that you could probably go around the league and take a look at who might be in expiring contracts or who might be available. There's probably a lot of, inexpensive options that way, depending on how a high end of a defenseman he might be looking for. Goaltending, it's a little bit trickier to do right now. There's certainly not a lot of, at least quality goaltending on the market. So hard to say how they proceed here. Now, the Philadelphia Flyers have been linked to Sergei Bobrovsky, but it's widely believed that they likely would not be able to obtain him in a trade from the Columbus Blue Jackets. As we know, with Bobrovsky coming into training camp, he's been very coy on his future. Hasn't really alluded to too much what his future plans are, except to say to the media that management's aware of what he wants to do, and he kind of really won't discuss it, and it hasn't really been, prompted for too much information here in a while. But with Columbus being in the playoff hunt and doing relatively well this year, it's quite unlikely that they may not want to move him and probably will try to ride this out, see what they can do in the playoffs and try to address this on the offseason and hope that between him and Artemi Panarin that they can find a way to come to terms and keep their 2-star players, because obviously losing those guys would be a big blow to the team. But it's believed that if should Bobrovsky reach free agency, the Flyers would likely try to bring him back into the fold. Obviously, he was played with the Flyers in the past, has some history there, and that they might offer him a mega deal to try to bring him over. Now, of course, Bobrovsky's been believed to be looking for a longer-term deal, probably at least 6, if not 7 years, possibly 8 if he stayed in Columbus, but that's seems unlikely at this point. But it's rumored he's looking for $10.5 to $11 million based on the Carey Price contract. It's believed that he wants at least what he's making, seeing as he's had a better performance the last few years. So hard to say what he'll end up getting. I know that the Carey Price contract certainly sets a standard, but at the same time, I think the goalie market has certainly changed a bit in the last few years since that was first signed. So we'll see how that goes. But that's our information here on the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, I want to touch base quickly now on the Boston Bruins. Now, the Bruins, as we know, have been linked to a number of players over the last number of weeks, really since early in the season. It's been rumored that they're looking for some extra depth at the forward group. And the latest one that we've talked about before, mostly last year, not so much this year or during the offseason, maybe a little bit in the summer, was that the Boston Globe reporter is reporting that they should re-examine the possibility of trading Torrey Krug to the Oilers for Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. Now, that's a deal that was discussed at great length. Now, I don't know if the team teams ever get into serious talks. It was believed they had discussions, but I don't really know how far they ever went. Before, that was mostly last year when that was rumored to be kind of on the table or at least in discussion. We haven't really seen a whole lot about it since then. Torrey Krug had some pretty heavy rumors going around that they might look to move him before, but it's been quiet lately, especially with that blue line in Boston having their fair share of injuries this year. Nugent Hopkins had kind of found a new spot on the wing with McDavid, so he kind of had a new home, so it seemed unlikely he was going to move. But since Ken Hitchcock's taken over in Edmonton, he's kind of rejuggled those lines, and he's back to playing Draisaitl with McDavid, and Nugent Hopkins has been playing on a different line, mostly at center. So, Nugent Hopkins has proven he can be a quality left winger. He can also still be a pretty decent center, especially if he's slotted appropriately, probably a number 2 or possibly 3 on some teams, I guess. But either way, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins could possibly be, a piece the Oilers might look to move. Now, at this point, I probably would be a little surprised to see that deal go down, but to see the media like the Boston Globe kind of bringing it back up and make the suggestion, I don't blame them in a way. From the Boston perspective, it probably makes sense, assuming they had a healthy blue line. They wouldn't have to worry too much about salary cap implications, with take away Krug's salary, bring in Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. There's not a huge difference there, so certainly could be a possibility. They even suggested if they needed to kind of sweeten the pot, that they could throw in one of their younger forwards, maybe like an Anders Bjork, Danton Heinen, or one of those guys, along with Krug to kind of obtain Ryan Nugent-Hopkins from the Oilers. So I'm not sure that I'd see this deal go down, but I guess in some aspects it does make sense. The Oilers could certainly use a defenseman like Krug. I can see the Boston Bruins really utilizing a forward like Nugent-Hopkins. He's probably, to a degree, a lot what they're looking for. They want somebody who's versatile, who can play center, but can possibly move to wing as well at times, and he's proven he can be that and be productive. So I don't blame them for bringing it up, but at this point we don't have anything really firm to suggest that there's any talks going on, if they're kind of interested in making that happen. But depending on how things go the rest of the year here, I think it's more likely that the Bruins are still looking for that upgrade at forward like that we've been talking about for a while. They've been linked to Charlie Coyle as well, which we're going to touch base on here momentarily. And Krug very well might be a trade chip for them, but I'm not sure Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is really going to be going anywhere for the Oilers this season. Now, jumping over to the Wild, like we mentioned for Charlie Coyle, we mentioned before that the Bruins appeared to be showing interest, or at least it was believed to be, but we do have information from insider trading that suggests that Paul Fenton is actively shopping him, and he's likely also shopping Niederreiter. Now, they didn't say for sure that this was going down, but they said they had enough reason to believe that these two players are likely on the market, and Paul Fenton's been in charge long enough now in Minnesota to have a good grasp of what he wants to do with that club, and that these two guys are likely players he would be willing to move, but obviously looking for that right deal. And at this point, it's been believed that teams like Boston, Montreal, Ottawa were all interested in Coyle, but really I'm not sure now. LeBrun himself denied the fact, saying that he didn't think Montreal was interested. One of the other media guys that works for The Athletic as well, that knows LeBrun, has been writing about this, Michael Russo, so he kind of suggested to check that article out, saying that Russo believed the Habs were interested, but LeBrun said he didn't really think they were. And for Ottawa, I'm not really sure they would be either, to be honest. I mean, they've had their fair share of injuries, but where everything's at with that team, I really don't see them adding. That doesn't make sense to me. Now, I can see the Bruins being interested to a degree, but I don't know if Charlie Coyle really screams Bruins and really is the right guy that they need to look for. I mean, I can see them wanting to add a forward. I just don't know if he's the right player. But Paul Fenton, either way, with the Wild, appears ready to make some moves, and it looks like Coyle and or Niederreiter could be the trade chips that he's kind of shopping around to see how he might be able to improve his hockey club. Now, I want to touch base quickly here as well on the Chicago Blackhawks, just very quickly, and we talked about this the other day, how the fact that they very well might be looking to break up their core players, and maybe we could see a guy like either Keith or Seabrook on the move. Pierre LeBrun touched base on this on Insider Trading last night, indicating that he feels that Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane likely will be lifelong Blackhawks unless they decide they wanted to move on themselves. But he feels that it is possible that Seabrook or Keith, mostly Keith, is kind of the player they touched on, being due to his contract mostly and the fact that he's still playing at a bit higher level, that Duncan Keith very well could find himself on the move. But of course, he feels though that even though this is something that is possible, that he thinks Stan Bowen would more likely address this during the offseason. He probably would sit down with those guys and ask them if because they all have no move clauses to some extent, either partial or full no move. So he'd have to have that discussion with them anyways, see where they might want to go, see if they're interested in moving on, and kind of go from there. But at the same time, it wouldn't be a complete shocker to see a team approach the Chicago Blackhawks near the deadline and maybe try to add a Duncan Keith. I think out of the four kind of core guys there between him, Seabrook, Kane, and Toews, I really think Keith is likely the only one who has a decent shot at moving on, and obviously he's going to have a lot of say if he does that. But according to LeBron, he thinks that's more likely for the offseason if and when they go down that road. Now I want to touch base here quickly on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Darren Dreger was talking a little bit about the Leafs last night during Insider Trading, talking about the fact that they're possibly linked to the Flyers, who we discussed earlier in this video, possibly looking to add a power forward type of guy to their lineup, like a Wayne Simmons, for example. He even mentioned the possibility of maybe like a Michael Furlan in Carolina. I don't think Dreger had any information to suggest those teams were talking or anything like that. However, he just kind of used him as an example of the type of player they'd be looking to add, or at least what's been out there. But he doesn't really believe that that's so much the case. He still feels that if the Toronto Maple Leafs try to add to their team before the playoffs, that it will be a right-shot defenseman, preferably somebody who can play higher in the lineup, ideally in that top pair, so they can move Ron Hainsey down to play like more of a third pair minutes and kind of level up that D core and kind of strengthen things all around. A right shot top pair D is exactly what they're looking for, which we had discussed previously when we discussed the possibility of them maybe being interested in Alex Pietrangelo. Of course, it's hard to say if that's really the case, but certainly an interesting concept to think about. There's plenty of other right shot defensemen around the league as well, but of course it's going to depend a lot on the contract and what they are willing to give up. Like I mentioned before, I do think the Leafs would love to move Nikita Zaitsev. That would make a lot of sense for them to free up the money to really upgrade that D-core on the right side. Obviously they'd have to replace Zaitsev as well, but I do think they have enough other younger defensemen who could probably step into that, or maybe, depending on the deal, maybe bring back a less expensive defenseman to kind of finish out the season and replace him. I don't know exactly how they do it, but a lot of teams are going to be a little skeptical in taking Zaitsev's contract. Is the only problem. He's obviously not playing up to it right now, but I know that that's a contract they'd love to move if they were able to work that out. But I do think it's more likely that a right shot D is something that they go for in an attempt to kind of build themselves up for the Stanley Cup playoffs. But there has been a lot of chatter out there around, like I said, around a power forward to add some grit to that lineup. And you know what? You can always have that type of player for the playoffs. It really helps, as the playoffs are a whole different beast. But at the same time, they have a ton of scoring there, and they might not want to tinker too much with that forward group. I don't think there's a lot there they'd want to give up, especially for a short-term player or a rental situation. I just don't see that being something that the Maple Leafs would do. Now, talking about the Maple Leafs, there's been a lot of chatter lately, and I just kind of want to throw my 2 cents in here on the possibility that Toronto Maple Leafs forwards Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner. Matthews seemed to be the one out of the two that's talked about more, that they would be the prime target for an offer sheet if they're not signed to new contracts by July the 1st. Now, of course, as we know, and as you probably know, they're restricted free agents in the final year of their entry-level contract, so they're eligible anytime now to sign an extension. We didn't suspect any of that to go down while the William Nylander talks were going on until that saga was completed and he was dealt with accordingly. And now that that's been done, I'm sure Kyle Dubas's attention has moved over to those guys. But we haven't really had any reports to suggest that they're making a lot of talks or making any progress there. So it's not really known exactly where things are at with those two guys. However, there's not a big rush. They do have until July 1st before they can ever be offer sheeted. But I'm sure that Kyle Dubas and company with the Toronto Maple Leafs do not want to go down a situation like they just had with William Nylander. I mean, that was really long and drawn out. And, it obviously caused a lot of stress for the team. Unclear about the future. I'm sure they don't want to do that, especially, really I think it's safe to say Marner and Matthews are certainly held a little bit higher regard, a little bit slightly more important, obviously, than Nylander. So I do think that's something they want to avoid if at all possible. Now, if they reach July 1st and they do not have contracts, other teams can present an offer sheet to them. Now, just to be clear on how this works, because I see all kinds of chatter on social media, and a lot of what I see really does not make any sense. So just to be clear, a team can offer a restricted free agent anything they want. It's just considered an offer sheet. The player could say, you know what, I have no interest in leaving the team that I'm with. I'm not signing that. Or they can look at it and be like, wow, that's a lot of money. I'd like to stay. I hope my team matches it. But if they don't want to pay me that, I got to go for it. So depending on how they feel about it, they can choose to sign the offer sheet or not. So it's entirely up to them. Just like when they're a UFA, other teams can pitch offers, but they're not obligated to sign. Obviously, they're entirely free-willed to do what they want that way. Now, should the Maple Leafs forwards receive an offer sheet that they just feel is too good to pass up and they sign it, obviously the Maple Leafs have a certain amount of time to match the offer, and they have first right of refusal on that. They can either say, yes, we'll match the offer, they keep the player, or they go the other route and say, you know what, that's a little too rich for our blood, sayonara. But then in return, they get a whole bunch of compensation, and that compensation is determined by the contract that the player ends up signing with the new team. Depending on how high the value is, determines the package of draft picks that they receive from that team. So if you take a look around, we're probably looking at, based on the numbers that are speculated that these guys might get, probably looking at multiple first round picks, probably 2 to 3, with potential second or third rounders being involved as well. So that is a very hefty price tag, but at the end of the day here, it might be worth taking a chance, depending on how, if you think about how much your team might improve by adding one of these guys. Obviously, if you're going to end up finishing higher, much higher in the standings, and those first round picks are going to be lower, there's certainly a lot to consider. But at the same time, the argument I see from a lot of, especially Toronto media, Toronto fans, etc., is that the bull burning bridges, that any team won't do it because they're feared of being retaliated against by having it done to their players. And based on comments I've heard from other, other media NHL insiders, general managers, I'm not sure that that's the case anymore. It seems to be all bets are off. That whole thing about I'm not going to target yours so that you don't target mine doesn't sound like that really applies anymore. And that if we were ever going to see a more recent sample size of this, that it's going to come one of these two guys, because they're by far the biggest names that could possibly make it to that status in a long time. Now, of course, they're not the only big name RFAs this season as well. They look around the league. We got Mikko Rantanen leading the league in scoring. There's lots of other guys as well. You get Patrick Laine, the Winnipeg Jets. So they're certainly not the only ones. Of course, everybody likes to talk about the Leafs because, in a lot of ways, they've been a hot topic here this season. But they're not the only RFAs that are in this boat. So I'm not sure why we don't see media and other personalities talking about other players that could be in this boat as well. Personally, I think the main reason that another team would target these guys, as much as they'd love to have them on their team, they would be trying to do it to put the Leafs in cap hell, basically. They could offer these guys something completely ridiculously high. A stupid figure like 14, 15 million. And really, that's going to make it so that the team, obviously wants the match to keep the player, but they're going to make it so that the player can't refuse. I mean, that's ultimately the goal. They'd be trying to hurt Toronto from a financial standpoint, that they wouldn't be able to keep their players, and they'd be forced to trade somebody else, trying to weaken the team. That's the rationale behind it, more so because of the compensation they'd have to give up should they not match would be crazy, and then they'd be putting themselves in a bad spot as well. I mean, as much as they improve by getting that player, they're going to lose a lot of other potential by giving up all those picks. So, you know what? It probably is very unlikely we see it, because it's kind of a game of Russian roulette almost. Like, you don't want to be retaliated against. You're probably trying to hurt them from a cap perspective, but at the same time, they could, choose not to match, and then all of a sudden now you're stuck with this massive contract too. So it can backfire on you. So for that reason, I think it's highly doubtful that we'll see either of these players be offer sheeted, but really they're not the only ones. Like, as I mentioned in other videos, there is a huge list of very, very productive top player RFAs we're going to see this summer, and it's not just the Maple Leafs that are in danger of this. There's so many big name RFAs this year, it's crazy, and we're going to see a huge off season that, really it's not just these guys. If you be talking about Rantanen or many others, Laine, just to name a few others, that would really kind of fit the same kind of situation here, that those teams could be in a lot of cap trouble as well, based on the fact that they have to give these guys huge salaries to compensate for their huge performances. So anyways, that's just my 2 cents on the offer sheets. I do think it's highly doubtful, but when you're talking about players that are potential targets, it's not just the Leafs. It's really a lot of teams around the league that should be fearful of this moving forward, because there's a lot of big name RFAs looking for big money in the summer of 2019. If you're new to the channel, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up before you go. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.